Hello, I'm Dr. Sue Brunning and I'm curator of the European Early Medieval collections at the British Museum. And this means that I'm also responsible for Sutton Hoo. Now, many of you will have probably seen the Netflix film The Dig by now, and also the amazing reaction to it, which has kind of led to a surge of interest in early medieval archaeology all over the world, really. And I think that at the museum we're going to expect a lot of visitors coming when we're open again, and maybe also at Apulkara too. So you may have been wondering, how accurate are the excavation scenes, how close to real events the story in the film is. Well, I can say that myself and colleagues at the museum assisted the filmmakers with their research, so I'm going to try to answer some of those questions now. First of all, the excavation. Well, members of the art department came to the museum to look at the hundreds of photographs of the excavation that we have in our archive, and they were able to learn about the details of the ship, how it was imprinted into the ground, how the objects were laid out into the grave, and also things like what tools the excavators were using, and even the kinds of clothes that they were wearing. And they used this information to create a really impressive reconstruction of the ship. I was lucky enough to actually visit the set, and I was completely convinced by what I saw. It was almost like those photographs that I knew so well from our archive had come to life. So those scenes where the objects are excavated in the film, really exciting sequence, this was also quite accurate. And the filmmakers were following even very small details that they picked up from the photographs. So, for example, the purse lid, famous purse lid from Sutton Hoo, was found in the ground upside down, and we can see that from the photographs in the archive. And they also copied this in the film, even though all of the decoration on the purse is actually on the top. So you can imagine that a director might be keen to show that decoration, but they were so keen to follow actually what happened that they showed the purse lid as it was found upside down. And if we compare the photos carefully with what we see in the film, we can also see small details like the kinds of kneeling pads that the archaeologists were using, their brushes, their shovels. These things were quite closely copied from the photographs, and Basil Brown's costume as well, down to the pocket watch that he wears in his waistcoat. A bit more dramatic license was used with the story and the characters. I was much less involved in helping the filmmakers to develop these, but I did help Rafe Fiennes come and research Basil Brown at the museum. We're very lucky to have Basil Brown's original diaries and notebook that he made when he was working on the dig in 1939. And so, of course, these are a really important source of information for somebody who would be playing Basil Brown, because they're first-hand accounts written in his own voice. We also have lots of photographs of Basil in action, and I think that Rafe Fiennes did a really good job combining all of that information in his performance, and he creates a performance that I think is actually quite close to how I imagine Basil Brown would have been in real life. Now, I'll do a slight spoiler alert there for you here, in case you haven't watched the film, rather. I've been asked many times if the trench really did collapse on Basil Brown, as we see in the film, and he has to be rescued by Edith Pretty, being pulled out from underneath the earth. Now, the answer is that the trench did collapse on one occasion during the excavation, but it didn't collapse on Basil Brown, or anybody else for that matter. What we do have is a description in his diary where he says that the trench collapsed and it was quite a near miss. So a bit of artistic license perhaps there. And while I'm talking about spoilers, I may as well talk about another dramatic moment in the film. So again, spoiler alert. I've also been asked a lot about whether a Spitfire really did crash in the river by the site during the excavation. And this is another piece of dramatic license, but something that does still draw upon real events. So a few years later, during World War II, an American B-17 bomber did actually crash in the Deben River near Sutton Hoo, and only 2 crewmen survived. So a rather sad echo of real events represented in the film there. There's also 1 or 2 quite cinematic moments or things that the filmmakers chose to leave out. One of these was that Edith Pretty was quite interested in spiritualism, and there is a story, and it may just be a story, that she was motivated to dig by a vision of figures on top of the mound. Another is a story from the excavator Stuart Piggott, who's represented in the film and played by the actor Ben Chaplin. And that's the story that he visited the local pub with some of the gold in his pockets, but the locals didn't believe him when he said, "Oh yes, I've got my pockets, I have gold in my pockets," when they asked him if they'd discovered gold on the site. So that was probably quite lucky. And this goes to show, I think, that sometimes real life is just as dramatic as fiction.